Picture this, a wealthy widow standing on her own property, watching as American forces prepare to burn down her magnificent mansion. Her hands rest on a bow made of ash wood, fingers tracing the grain she memorized months ago when instinct told her to buy it. The arrows, 12 of them, fletched with turkey feathers, lean against the wall of the overseer's cottage where she now lives, where British soldiers forced her to live after they took everything else. May 1781. The air smells like spring and gunpowder, that mixture the war has made familiar across South Carolina. Rebecca Bruton Mott is 49 years old. Her daughters stand beside her, silent. Mary, 23, has her father's jaw and her mother's steel. Rebecca Jr., 21, holds a childhood doll salvaged before the eviction, clutching it like she's still 8 years old and nothing has gone wrong yet. On the hill above them, British soldiers walk the fortifications built around Rebecca's home. Her drawing room where Jacob taught their daughters to read Latin. Her gardens where she cultivated roses from cuttings her mother brought from Charleston. Her life transformed into a military stronghold by men who speak her language but serve a king she no longer recognizes as hers. Captain Finley approaches from the American camp, young and professional in his Legion uniform. His eyes find the arrows. Rebecca lifts the bow. The weight feels right, though she's never fired it. Some knowledge lives in the body before the mind catches up. Her voice comes out steady, more certain than she feels inside, where grief and resolution wrestle for dominance. These are for you. Captain, wrap the heads in pitch and oil. Make them burn hot enough that water won't help. Finley takes the bow like it might break. Ma'am, are you certain? I bought these 6 months ago. Rebecca's interruption is gentle but absolute. I didn't know why then. I do now. My house or my country. That's not a choice. It's an inevitability. She turns to her daughters. These women she raised in rooms that will be ash by tomorrow. Mary's face shows the anger Rebecca wishes she could still feel. Rebecca Jr.'s tears are the ones Rebecca buried months ago, when crying became a luxury she couldn't afford. The distant sound of men preparing for siege floats across the spring afternoon. Shovels biting earth. Officers calling orders. The mechanical rhythm of war readying itself to consume whatever stands in its path. In 36 hours, British soldiers and American militia will sit together at her table, breaking bread over the ruins of everything she built. But first, men will die. Her home will burn. And the price of independence will be paid in ways no declaration or battlefield can fully capture. This is South Carolina, 1781. This is what revolution costs when it comes for you personally. The year is 1781, and the American Revolution has been bleeding the continent for 6 brutal years. Not the clean war of principles that pamphlets promised in 1775. Not the gentleman's conflict where armies met in open fields and losers surrendered with honor intact. 6 years of death that taught everyone involved what it actually means to fight for an idea when the idea demands everything you have and everyone you love. Most people who learn history in schools hear about the famous moments. Lexington and Concord, where farmers fired on regulars and started something that couldn't be stopped. Bunker Hill, where colonists proved they'd stand against professional soldiers. Saratoga, where Gates trapped Burgoyne and convinced France that Americans might actually win. These battles made the history books because they looked like turning points on maps, clean arrows showing the trajectory of independence. But between those famous days, hundreds of smaller engagements determined who would live and who would die, which communities would survive and which would burn, whether the revolution would succeed in individual towns and counties where the abstract idea of liberty collided with the concrete reality of neighbors killing neighbors. Fort Mott was one of them, a siege you've probably never heard about that might be the most fascinating story the revolution produced, if you measure fascination by the weight of human choice under impossible pressure. By spring 1781, the war had evolved into something darker than the idealistic conflict that started at Lexington. This wasn't just British regulars fighting Continental soldiers anymore. The revolution had become a civil war, a vicious internal struggle that turned brother against brother, father against son, communities against themselves. Nowhere was this transformation more complete than South Carolina, where the conflict took on a character so brutal that even hardened soldiers from European wars found themselves shocked by the violence. The rules of 18th century warfare, those gentlemanly conventions about prisoner treatment and civilian protection, evaporated in the South Carolina backcountry like morning dew under a cruel sun. Prisoners got executed. Houses burned for the crime of sheltering the wrong side. Families discovered that their political choices came with consequences measured in blood and ash. The countryside became a lawless territory where violence birthed more violence in cycles that fed on themselves, each atrocity justifying the next until nobody could remember who started it or why. To understand Fort Mott, you have to understand where the war stood in May 1781. The situation looked catastrophic for the American cause. Darker than Valley Forge, darker than the desperate winter of 1776 when Washington crossed the Delaware because he had nothing left to lose. After the disasters at Charleston and Camden in 1780, British forces under Lord Cornwallis seemed unstoppable across the South. Charleston's fall in May 1780 had been the worst American defeat of the entire war. Over 5,000 Continental soldiers surrendered. The city, the jewel of the southern colonies, the economic heart of the region, fell into British hands. General Benjamin Lincoln had been forced to surrender his entire command, marching out while British bands played mocking tunes and loyalist crowds jeered at the rebels who'd lost their gamble. Camden in August 1780 proved equally devastating. General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga who'd trapped an entire British army and forced their surrender, led his Southern army straight into destruction. Gates had been confident, even arrogant. He'd beaten the British before. He'd do it again. Cornwallis destroyed him. The American force, composed largely of inexperienced militia who'd never faced British regulars in open battle, broke when those regulars charged with fixed bayonets. The militia ran, just ran. Gates himself fled the battlefield, riding nearly 200 miles in 3 days, his military reputation earned at Saratoga evaporating in a single afternoon of panic and rout. The Continental Army in the South essentially ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. The British captured thousands of American soldiers, seized tons of military supplies, and established a network of fortified posts throughout South Carolina and Georgia. They held every major city, Charleston, Savannah, Georgetown. They controlled the main roads and navigable rivers. They had garrisons at strategic points throughout the interior, each one anchoring British authority over the surrounding countryside. On paper, British dominance looked complete, permanent. The Southern strategy appeared to be working exactly as London had planned. That strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Control the major cities, establish strong points in the interior, use loyalist militia to pacify the countryside between the forts. British strategists believed, perhaps not unreasonably given their intelligence, that most Southerners were actually loyal to the crown. Patriot sentiment, they thought, was limited to a relatively small number of radical agitators concentrated in certain areas. Once the Continental Army was defeated and these radical elements suppressed, the natural loyalism of the population would reassert itself. South Carolina and Georgia would return peacefully to British rule. North Carolina and Virginia would follow. The rebellion would collapse from the south upward, reversing the pattern of how it had spread. By early 1781, this strategy appeared to be working. British forces held Charleston, Savannah, and numerous inland forts. They controlled major transportation routes. American resistance seemed broken. Cornwallis felt confident enough to march his main army north into North Carolina and Virginia, leaving the South Carolina interior to be held by garrison troops and loyalist forces. The British had made a crucial miscalculation. They'd underestimated the determination of Patriot militia. More importantly, they'd underestimated two particular American commanders whose tactical genius and personal courage would shatter British control of the southern interior in a campaign so rapid and decisive that military historians still study it today. Francis Marion and Henry Lee, the Swamp Fox and Light Horse Harry, two men who couldn't have been more different in background, temperament, or military style. Two men who shouldn't have been able to work together, but would forge a partnership that changed the course of the war. Francis Marion. Even if you don't know much about the Revolution, you might recognize that name. They called him the Swamp Fox, and the nickname captured something essential about the man. Marion was slight, Barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, with a weathered face that looked like tan leather, a prominent nose, and dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wasn't a professional soldier in the European sense, never attended military academies or studied the great campaigns of Frederick the Great or the Duke of Marlborough, never learned the formal science of warfare that British officers absorbed as part of their education. He was something the British had never encountered before. A guerrilla fighter who knew every swamp, every creek, every hidden path in the South Carolina Lowcountry. A man who understood that winning didn't require destroying the enemy in pitched battle. Sometimes winning just meant surviving, making the enemy pay for every mile they advanced, making occupations so costly and dangerous that they'd eventually give up and leave. Marion's life before the Revolution had prepared him perfectly for this role, though he couldn't have known it. Born in 1732 in Berkeley County, South Carolina, he'd grown up in frontier conditions where self-reliance wasn't a virtue, but a requirement for survival. As a young man, he'd fought in the Cherokee War of 1761, learning wilderness warfare from Native American opponents who were absolute masters of ambush and hit-and-run tactics. He'd served as a militia officer, gaining leadership experience and developing an understanding of how irregular forces operated differently from conventional armies. When the Revolution came, Marion initially served in conventional military roles. He'd been at Fort Sullivan in 1776, where American forces repelled a British naval attack on Charleston through a combination of courage and luck. But after Charleston fell in 1780, when most of the Continental Army in the South was captured, Marion found himself one of the few officers still at large. He took to the swamps with a small band of followers and began a campaign of harassment that made him legendary. Marion's tactics were devastatingly simple. He never fought fair by British standards, never met them in open battle where their superior numbers, training, and equipment would inevitably prevail. Instead, he struck from ambush. His men would appear suddenly on a lonely road, attack a British supply convoy or courier, then vanish into the swamps before reinforcements could arrive. They traveled light, lived off the land, moved constantly. British forces would search for Marion's camp, thrashing through swamps for days, only to find abandoned fire pits and cold trails leading nowhere. The British hated him with an obsession that bordered on madness. Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, one of Britain's most aggressive and ruthless commanders, spent weeks trying to corner Marion in late 1780. Tarleton was young, ambitious, and utterly without mercy. He'd earned the nickname Bloody Ban for his treatment of American prisoners and his willingness to burn farms and terrorize civilians in pursuit of military objectives. But even Tarleton couldn't catch the swamp fox. After one particularly frustrating chase that led his cavalry through miles of impassable terrain, Tarleton reportedly said in disgust, "As for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him." The nickname stuck. Marion became the Swamp Fox, the ghost in South Carolina's marshlands who materialized to strike and vanish before retaliation was possible. Marion's success wasn't just about tactics. His greatest weapon was intelligence. He had informants everywhere, enslaved people who overheard British officers' conversations and passed information through networks the British never suspected existed. Small farmers who looked like loyalists but quietly supported the Patriot cause. Even some ostensible loyalists who hedged their bets by feeding information to both sides. When British forces moved, Marion often knew about it before they'd marched 10 miles. When Loyalist militia gathered, word reached Marion's camp within hours. This intelligence network was his greatest asset, allowing him to be where the British weren't and strike when they least expected it. His men were as unconventional as their leader. They weren't soldiers in any regular sense. They were planters, farmers, artisans, and hunters who would gather when Marion called, fight a battle or conduct a raid, then disperse back to their farms and trades. They had no uniforms, often no shoes, and carried whatever weapons they could find. Some had muskets, others carried hunting rifles. A few just had pistols or even swords and knives. They looked like bandits or brigands, not soldiers. But they were fiercely devoted to Marion and to the cause of independence. They'd seen British occupation firsthand, watched their homes burned, their property seized, their neighbors executed. They fought with the desperate conviction of men defending their own land against invaders. Yet Marion had a fundamental problem in spring 1781. Guerrilla warfare could harass the British, make their lives miserable, disrupt their supply lines and communications. But it couldn't dislodge them from their fortified positions. To do that, he needed siege equipment, trained soldiers who could conduct formal military operations, and military expertise he simply didn't possess. That's where Henry Lee came in. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lee, known as Light Horse Harry Lee, was a different species of soldier entirely. Where Marion was rough-hewn and frontier-born, Lee embodied Virginia aristocracy. Born in 1756 into one of Virginia's most prominent families, he'd received the education appropriate to his class. The College of New Jersey, what we now call Princeton University, where he studied classics, philosophy, history. He could quote Plutarch in Latin and discuss military theory with the sophistication of a European staff officer. Lee came from the Virginia gentry, that class of plantation owners who saw themselves as natural leaders, the American equivalent of Britain's landed aristocracy. His family owned estates and enslaved people. They held social positions that brought them into contact with men like George Washington. Lee and Washington shared more than military service. They were fellow Virginians from similar backgrounds, men who understood each other's world and the unspoken codes that governed it. When the Revolution began, Lee was just 19 years old, still a college student. But he volunteered immediately and received a commission as a captain of cavalry. Young, ambitious, and fearless, he quickly earned a reputation for aggressive leadership and tactical innovation. In 1777, at just 21 years old, he was promoted to major and given command of a cavalry unit. By 1779, he'd been promoted again to lieutenant colonel and given permission to expand his force into what became known as Lee's Legion. Lee's Legion was unlike any other unit in the Continental Army. It combined cavalry and light infantry in a single flexible force that could adapt to different tactical situations. The cavalry, mounted on fast horses and armed with sabers and pistols, could move quickly and strike hard. The light infantry, trained to fight in loose formation rather than the rigid European line, could support the cavalry or operate independently. Together, they formed a highly mobile strike force that could fight either mounted or on foot, adapting to whatever the mission required. Lee drilled his men relentlessly. Unlike militia units that gathered briefly and then dispersed, Lee's Legion trained constantly. They practiced cavalry charges until horses and riders moved as one organism. They rehearsed infantry maneuvers until complex movements became instinctive. They learned to fight at night, to move silently, to coordinate actions between cavalry and infantry with the precision of a watch mechanism. Lee was demanding, some said harsh, but his men became some of the best trained soldiers in the American Army, professionals who could match British regulars in discipline and exceed them in flexibility. The young colonel was also something of a dandy. Even on campaign, he maintained standards of dress and deportment that other officers found excessive. His uniform, though adapted for field service, was impeccably tailored. He wore his hair powdered when circumstances permitted. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew his own worth and expected others to recognize it immediately. Some saw this as vanity. Others recognized that Lee's attention to appearance was strategic. Soldiers fought better when their officers looked the part. Discipline started with visual cues. A well-dressed officer commanded respect automatically, creating psychological advantages that translated into battlefield effectiveness. George Washington himself had praised Lee's tactical skill on multiple occasions. Lee's Legion had participated in some of the war's most dramatic engagements. At Paulus Hook in 1779, Lee led a daring night assault that captured a British fortification through surprise and perfect execution. The attack was so precisely coordinated that the British garrison surrendered before they fully understood what was happening. Congress awarded Lee a gold medal for this action, one of only 8 presented during the entire war. But Lee had a problem that would haunt him throughout his life and eventually destroy him. He lived beyond his means. Even as a young officer accumulating military glory, he accumulated debts with equal enthusiasm. He dressed well, entertained lavishly when possible, maintained standards appropriate to his social position. The problem was that military pay, especially in the Continental Army with its chronic financial troubles, couldn't support such a lifestyle. Lee was constantly scrambling for money, borrowing from friends and family, making promises he couldn't quite keep. This financial instability would eventually ruin him in the years after the war. But in May 1781, sitting in his tent the night before he was scheduled to meet Francis Marion for the first time, he was still the golden boy of the Continental Army, a rising star with what seemed like a brilliant future ahead of him. He was reading a letter from his cousin in Virginia by candlelight. The words cut deeper than any British saber. "Henry, your military glory means nothing if the family is ruined. Creditors are circling the estate. Mother is beside herself with worry. We need £500 immediately or we lose the property. Your continental pay won't cover it. The family needs you to think about more than medals and campaigns." Lee's hands shook slightly as he folded the letter with meticulous care, using precision to control emotion. He was 25 years old. Congress had given him a gold medal. Washington called him brilliant, and he couldn't pay his mother's debts. He looked down at his boots, polished to a mirror shine. They'd cost more than a private's monthly pay. What was he doing? Fighting for liberty while his family faced bankruptcy? Maintaining appearances while creditors circled his ancestral home like vultures? But he couldn't stop. Appearance mattered. Officers had to look the part. His men respected the uniform, the bearing, the aristocratic confidence. If they knew he was broke, if they saw the desperation behind the polished exterior. He carefully stored the letter with the others he couldn't answer yet. Tomorrow he'd meet Marion. Together they'd plan the campaign that would supposedly break British control of South Carolina's interior. Win this campaign, get promoted, prize money from captures, then fix everything. He had no idea that the debt would eventually consume him entirely, but that was years away. In May 1781, he was still Light Horse Harry Lee, and he had wars to win before reality caught up with him. In early 1781, General Nathaniel Greene, now commanding American forces in the South after Gates's disaster at Camden, made a decision that would change the strategic picture. He sent Lee's legion to South Carolina with orders to cooperate with Francis Marion. The combination of Marion's local knowledge and guerrilla expertise with Lee's professional troops and siege capabilities would prove devastating to British plans. Their target was the string of forts protecting the British interior: Fort Watson, Fort Mott, Fort Granby, Fort 96. These strongholds allowed the British to control the countryside and protect their supply lines. If these forts fell, the British position in South Carolina would collapse. Cornwallis would be isolated in Virginia, cut off from his bases in the South. Lee and Marion first struck Fort Watson in mid-April 1781. They used a clever innovation, building a tower that allowed American riflemen to fire down into the fort, negating the defensive advantage of walls. They forced a British surrender through ingenuity rather than overwhelming force. The victory proved that British fortified positions could be taken. It gave the combined force confidence and momentum. The partnership worked despite everything that should have made it fail. Lee's Legion troops and Marion's militia looked at each other with mutual suspicion initially. Lee's men were professionals who drilled constantly and maintained military standards. Marion's fighters were farmers who gathered when called and dispersed when missions ended. Cultural and class differences divided the two forces like a chasm, but Lee and Marion respected each other. Lee recognized that Marion's knowledge of terrain and people was irreplaceable. Marion saw that Lee's trained troops and siege equipment could accomplish what guerrilla warfare alone never could. They communicated well, divided responsibilities according to each unit's strengths, and created something greater than the sum of their parts. After Fort Watson, they needed to move quickly before the British could reinforce their remaining posts. Their next target was Fort Mott. And this is where Rebecca Bruton Mott's story intersects with the military campaign and transforms it into something more than just another siege. Fort Mott sat on a high hill overlooking the Congaree River, roughly halfway between Charleston and the South Carolina interior. The location was strategically vital. The fort controlled the main road from Charleston to the backcountry and watched over a crucial river crossing. Any British force moving supplies or reinforcements had to pass near Fort Mott. Whoever held this position controlled communications and logistics for much of central South Carolina. But Fort Mott wasn't originally a fort at all. It was a plantation house, a beautiful mansion belonging to a widow named Rebecca Bruton Mott. And Rebecca's story deserves to be told in full because her choices would prove as important as any military decision Lee or Marion made. Rebecca came from Charleston society's upper tier. The Bruton family were wealthy merchants and planters who'd lived in South Carolina for generations. They had money, connections, social position. Rebecca had married Jacob Mott, a successful planter, and together they'd built a prosperous life. The mansion on the hill overlooking the Congaree was their achievement, their legacy to pass to their daughters. Jacob died in 1768, relatively young, leaving Rebecca a widow at 36 with a large plantation to manage and children to raise. In the 18th century, widowhood could be economically and socially devastating for a woman. Without a husband, a widow's property rights became uncertain. Her social position depended on male relatives' goodwill. Many widows remarried quickly out of practical necessity rather than affection. Rebecca Mott didn't remarry. She ran the plantation herself, managing the enslaved workforce, negotiating contracts, maintaining the property. She proved herself a capable businesswoman in an era that assumed women couldn't handle such responsibilities. She raised her daughters, Mary and Rebecca Jr., to be educated and independent. She became a respected figure in her community, known for intelligence and determination. When the revolution came to South Carolina, Rebecca didn't hesitate. She supported the American cause with her money, her influence, and eventually, as we'll see, with the ultimate sacrifice. The revolution wasn't an abstract political concept for her. It was personal. She'd built a life through her own efforts after her husband's death. The idea that she should be subject to laws and taxes imposed by a parliament where she had no representation, where no woman could ever have representation, where colonial concerns were dismissed by men who'd never set foot in America, that idea offended everything she believed about justice and natural rights. When British forces occupied the South Carolina interior in 1780 after Camden's disaster, they recognized Fort Mott's strategic importance immediately. They commandeered Rebecca's mansion, evicted her family at Bayonet Point, and converted her home into a military stronghold. They dug ditches around the property, built earthwork walls, erected a wooden palisade. The elegant plantation house became a fortress. British soldiers occupied her rooms, slept in her beds, used her possessions. Her gardens became a military encampment. Her property became enemy territory. Rebecca and her daughters were forced to move to a smaller house nearby, the overseer's cottage, within sight of their former home. Imagine that, watching enemy soldiers living in your house every single day, seeing them walk through rooms where your children were born, knowing they're sleeping in the bed you shared with your husband, having your entire life visible but unreachable, occupied by men who speak your language, but serve a cause you oppose with every fiber of your being. For nearly a year, Rebecca endured this, waiting for the day when American forces might drive the British out and restore what had been taken. In January 1781, months before Lee and Marion would arrive, Rebecca made an unusual purchase. A traveling merchant came through the area, carrying goods for sale. Among his wares, a bow made of ash wood and a quiver of 12 arrows fletched with turkey feathers. Rebecca bought them. Expensive purchase, unusual for a woman of her class and circumstances. The merchant asked what she planned to do with them. Hunt? Target practice? Rebecca examined the bow, testing its weight and flex. She had no experience with archery, didn't know why she felt compelled to buy these particular items. Instinct. Intuition. Some voice in her mind that said, "You'll need these. Buy them now." She answered the merchant vaguely, paid, and took the bow and arrows home to the cottage. Her daughters asked what she intended to do with them. Rebecca couldn't explain. She stored them in a corner, where they waited through winter and into spring. Purpose unclear, but presence somehow necessary. By May 1781, that purpose was approaching rapidly. Lee and Marion had captured Fort Watson. Now they were marching toward Fort Mott with about 600 men. The British garrison under Lieutenant Donald McPherson consisted of about 170 soldiers. McPherson was a professional officer, experienced and capable. He knew Lee and Marion were coming. He knew Fort Watson had fallen, but he was confident his fortifications would hold. And he had good reason for that confidence. On May 7, 1781, word reached Rebecca's cottage that American forces were approaching. Within days, possibly hours, the siege would begin. Rebecca sent word that she wished to speak with the American commanders. That night, alone in the cottage after her daughters had gone to sleep, Rebecca took out the miniature portrait of Jacob she'd kept safe through all the disruptions. She sat by the window where she could see her mansion on the hill, British campfires visible in the darkness. She talked to the portrait, her voice quiet so her daughters wouldn't hear. Jacob, I'm about to do something you'd either admire or think me mad. Tomorrow I meet with American commanders. They'll want to take our home, and I'm going to help them destroy it. The words hung in the darkness. Saying them aloud made them real in a way thinking them hadn't. Do you remember when we built that house? You drew the plans yourself, said it would last generations. Our grandchildren would be born in those rooms. Our great-grandchildren would learn to walk on those floors. And now I'm going to burn it. Her voice cracked slightly. She paused, gathering control. I'm not brave, Jacob. I'm terrified. That house is all I have left of you. Your study where you taught Mary to read. The garden where you proposed. The bedroom where we were happy. When it burns, you burn with it. The last traces of you. Gone. Long silence. Just the night sounds of Carolina spring and the distant noise of British sentries changing watch. But you'd understand, wouldn't you? You always said a man's worth isn't his property, it's his principles. The choices he makes when everything's at stake. Well, everything's at stake now. Those British soldiers on our porch. They're why our daughters can't live freely, why Mary can't inherit property properly, why Rebecca will be subject to laws she didn't consent to. You'd burn the house yourself if you were here. Tears now, but her voice stayed steady. But you're not here. It's me. Just me. And I'm so tired of being strong, Jacob. So tired of making decisions alone, of raising our girls without you, of watching this damn war tear everything apart. She wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders. But tomorrow I'll go to that camp. I'll offer them the tools to destroy everything we built. Because you taught me. Freedom isn't free. Someone has to pay. Tomorrow I pay. Just give me strength. One more time. Please. She kissed the portrait and put it away carefully. A voice from the doorway made her turn. Mary stood there in her nightdress, watching. Mary's voice was soft. Mother? I thought you were asleep. Were you speaking to Father? Rebecca composed herself quickly. Yes. Foolish, isn't it? Talking to the dead. Mary came in and sat beside her mother. Not foolish. I talk to him too sometimes. What did he say? Rebecca managed a small smile. He said to do what's necessary. He always did. Are we going to lose the house? Rebecca took her daughter's hand. Yes, but we're going to gain something more important. What? The right to make our own choices, to live by laws we consent to raise your children in freedom. Your father would call that a fair trade. Mary's tears came then. I'll miss it. Our home. Rebecca pulled her daughter close. So will I, darling. So will I. But homes are where we are together, not buildings. We'll always be together. They sat in silence, watching the distant campfires on the hill, until Mary fell asleep against her mother's shoulder. Rebecca stayed awake, watching the darkness, preparing herself for what morning would bring. The next day, May 8, 1781, Rebecca Mott walked to the American camp. Lee and Marion were surprised to see a well-dressed widow approaching their military position. They received her courteously but with obvious confusion about her purpose. Rebecca stood before them, two commanders who represented such different Americas, Lee the aristocrat, Marion the frontiersman, and spoke with the calm certainty of someone who'd already decided and was simply informing others of her choice. Gentlemen, I am Mrs. Rebecca Mott. That mansion you're planning to besiege is my home. I'm here to discuss how we might expedite its capture. Lee and Marion exchanged glances. Marion spoke first, his rough voice gentler than usual. Ma'am, we'll do everything possible to preserve your property. Siegecraft can be precise. Rebecca cut him off with a slight shake of her head. Colonel Marion, I appreciate the sentiment, but we both know you don't have time for a careful siege. Lord Rawdon is gathering a relief force in Charleston. You need Fort Mott taken quickly before he arrives. Lee's eyebrows rose. This widow had better intelligence than some of his own scouts. You're remarkably well informed. Mrs. Mott. I've lived here all my life, Colonel Lee. I know everyone in the district. People talk, and I've had a year to watch British operations from very close range. She paused, then continued with careful precision. You'll need to burn the roof. The house is wooden. The shingles will catch. Smoke and fire will make the position untenable. The garrison will surrender rather than burn alive. Marion studied her face. Ma'am, you understand what you're proposing? Your home will be destroyed. I understand perfectly. I've had months to prepare for this moment. Rebecca met his eyes without flinching. Will you do it? Or must I offer my assistance to another commander who's less squeamish about what victory requires? The challenge hung in the air. Lee spoke carefully. Mrs. Mott, we're grateful for your patriotism, but using fire feels dishonorable? Rebecca's tone sharpened. Colonel Lee, honor is a luxury for men with options. You have perhaps 4 days before Rawdon arrives. Conventional siege would take a week or more. Mathematics doesn't care about honor. Victory does. Lee had no answer. Marion's weathered face showed something like admiration. You've thought this through. For 11 months, I've thought about little else. Watching them occupy my home. Watching them turn my gardens into fortifications. I'm not acting on impulse, gentlemen. I'm acting on principle. Rebecca reached into the bag she'd brought. I have a bow and arrows. I purchased them months ago, though I didn't consciously know why. Now I do. Take them. Wrap the arrowheads in pitch and oil. Make them burn hot enough that water won't stop them. She held out the bow and quiver. Neither officer moved immediately. Her voice dropped, became almost conversational, but carried absolute conviction. My husband built that house. We raised our daughters there. It represents everything we worked for, everything we achieved together. In destroying it, I lose my past and my security. But my daughters gain their future. That's not a difficult choice, gentlemen. It's the only choice. Lee took the bow finally, handling it like something fragile. Mrs. Mott, I promise you, when we take the fort, your sacrifice will be remembered. Don't promise remembrance, Colonel. Promise victory. That's the only thing that makes today worthwhile. Marion stood and Lee followed his lead, both men rising in respect for something they couldn't quite name, but recognized instinctively. Ma'am, we'll take the fort. You have my word. Rebecca nodded once, then turned to leave. At the tent entrance, she paused and looked back. Gentlemen, one more thing. After you've taken the fort, after the British have surrendered, I would be honored if you would join me for dinner. You, your officers, and the British commander. All of you. Together. Lee's confusion was obvious. You want to dine with the men who occupied your home? I want to dine with soldiers who did their duty on both sides. This war will end someday, Colonel Lee. When it does, we must live together again as neighbors. We might as well practice civility now. Her expression softened slightly. Besides, I suspect you'll all be hungry. She left before they could respond, walking back toward her cottage with the bearing of someone who'd just made history but didn't need anyone to tell her so. Lee and Marion stood in silence after she departed. Finally, Marion spoke, his voice carrying grudging respect. That woman has more courage than half my militia. Lee still held the bow. She's going to watch her home burn, everything she has, and then serve us dinner. Harry, we need to take that fort. For her. For what she's sacrificing. Lee met Marion's eyes, seeing understanding pass between them without words. We will. 4 days. Whatever it takes. They had no idea yet that Rebecca Mott's sacrifice would help turn the tide of the revolution in the South, that the fall of Fort Mott would trigger a cascade of British defeats that would lead directly to Yorktown and American independence. They just knew that a widow had handed them the tools to burn her life down and asked only that they make it mean something. On the hill above them, British Lieutenant Donald McPherson watched American forces take positions around his fortified mansion. He was confident in his defenses, confident that relief would arrive before the siege could succeed. He had no way of knowing that the woman who owned this house had just ensured his defeat. The siege was about to begin, and the price of freedom was about to be paid in fire, sacrifice, and choices that would echo across generations. May 8, 1781. American forces surrounded Fort Mott by nightfall, cutting the British garrison off from resupply and reinforcement. Lee's legion took the southern approaches, Marion's militia the northern. The deployment served multiple purposes beyond simple encirclement. If Lord Rawdon arrived with his relief column, the two American forces could support each other or conduct fighting withdrawals without being trapped. The positioning also forced Lieutenant McPherson to divide his defenders, unable to concentrate strength against a single attack vector. McPherson stood on the mansion's roof that first evening, surveying the American positions through a brass telescope. 32 years old, 10 years in His Majesty's service, veteran of campaigns in the Caribbean and the northern colonies. He'd defended fortifications before. This one was strong. The hill gave defenders commanding views of all approaches. The ditch surrounding the property was 8 feet deep and 12 feet wide. Earthwork walls backed by wooden palisade provided solid protection. The mansion itself offered thick walls and clear fields of fire. McPherson had 165 men, a mix of British regulars and loyalist militia, along with adequate ammunition, food stores sufficient for 3 weeks, and a well that had never run dry. His assessment was professional and confident. With proper defense, he could hold this position for weeks. Rawdon was gathering forces in Charleston, 140 miles distant, marching 15 miles per day through contested territory. The relief column should arrive by May 13 or 14. McPherson needed to hold 5 days, perhaps 6. After that, the Americans besieging him would find themselves trapped between his garrison and Rawdon's larger force. He lowered the telescope and addressed his officers gathered on the roof. "Gentlemen, they brought approximately 600 men against our 165. Those odds seem daunting until you remember that we hold fortified ground and they must attack uphill into prepared defenses. History suggests we have the advantage." Lieutenant Morrison, 24 years old and eager to prove himself. "How long do we hold, sir?" "As long as necessary. Relief is coming. Every day we remain in British hands is a strategic victory." Morrison gestured toward the American positions. "That's Light Horse Harry Lee's Legion. They took Fort Watson in 8 days using some sort of tower tactic." McPherson nodded, already aware. "Fort Watson was poorly sited on flat ground. We occupy the high ground. They cannot build a tower tall enough to overlook our position without exposing it to our artillery. Different terrain, different tactical realities." He didn't mention what worried him more than American tactics: the presence of Francis Marion's militia. The Swamp Fox had a reputation for unconventional thinking that made European-trained officers uncomfortable. Marion didn't follow the rules. That made him unpredictable, dangerous. Below them in the American lines, preparations began immediately. Officers divided responsibilities. Lee's trained troops would conduct the formal siege work, digging approach trenches, building firing positions, coordinating artillery. Marion's militia would provide intelligence, conduct reconnaissance, and use their marksmanship to suppress British defenders. The work started after midnight when darkness provided some cover. Soldiers moved forward with picks, shovels, and fascines, bundles of sticks used to reinforce earthworks. The digging was back-breaking labor. South Carolina soil in May was hard-packed in some places, soft and muddy in others. Men dug by feel as much as sight, trying to make minimal noise. British sentries listened for sounds of digging and fired blindly into the darkness at suspicious noises. Musket balls buzzed over the workers' heads. Occasionally someone raised up too high and caught a ball. The man would cry out, clutch his wound, and his companions would drag him back, while others took his place in the trench. The casualties mounted slowly but steadily. By dawn of May 9th, the Americans had advanced their trenches several yards. They'd piled excavated earth on the side facing the fort, creating low walls that provided some protection. As daylight revealed their progress, British soldiers opened more sustained fire. The siege had truly begun. Among Marion's militia was a 17-year-old boy named Peter Horry, tall for his age, skinny, with angry eyes that had seen too much death already. His father had been killed at Camden the previous August. His mother died from fever 3 months later. Peter had shown up at Marion's camp last winter with nothing but a rifle and fury. Marion had tried to turn him away initially. "War isn't what you think, boy." Peter's response had been immediate and sharp. I don't care what it is. They killed my father. Teach me to kill them back. Marion saw himself 30 years earlier in that angry face. He'd made Peter a scout, kept him away from direct combat when possible, but the boy was fearless, recklessly so. Marion recognized the pattern. Peter wanted to die avenging his father. That kind of anger got young men killed quickly. There'd been an incident in December. British patrol spotted by Peter, who wanted to attack immediately. 8 redcoats against 2 scouts. Peter's voice had been insistent. We can take them, Uncle Francis. Marion grabbed his nephew's shoulder hard enough to leave marks. No. They're right there. Listen to me. Your father died because Gates ordered a foolish attack at Camden. Brave men charging superior positions. I will not watch you die the same way. I'm not afraid. I know, that's the problem. Fearless boys make dead heroes. I need you alive. Your mother would need you alive if she were still here. Being brave isn't charging into death. It's living long enough to win. Peter had gone silent, processing this. Then quietly, how do you know when to fight and when to wait? Marion's grip softened. That's what I'll teach you. Not how to die well, how to fight smart and stay breathing. By May 1781, Peter had survived a dozen skirmishes. He was still impulsive, still angry, but learning patience. Marion watched him constantly, the closest thing to a son the childless colonel would ever have. Now on the morning of May 9th, Peter was positioned among the riflemen tasked with suppressing British defenders. He'd been awake since midnight, had watched the trench diggers work, and was itching for action. Marion found him checking his rifle for the 3rd time. Marion's voice was quiet. You're on the firing line today. That means discipline. Pick your targets carefully. Make every shot count. No heroics. Yes, sir. Peter. Marion waited until the boy met his eyes. Your father was my friend, one of the best men I knew. If I get you killed through carelessness, I'll never forgive myself. Understand? Something shifted in Peter's expression. The anger didn't disappear, but it became more focused, less wild. I understand, Uncle Francis. I'll be careful. Good. Now get into position. When they show themselves, you know what to do. The riflemen settled into their firing positions around 9 in the morning. These weren't soldiers in the European sense. They were hunters who'd spent their lives shooting deer, turkey, and squirrel for food. Their rifles were more accurate than the smooth-bore muskets most soldiers carried. A good rifleman could hit a man-sized target at 200 yards, an impossible shot for a musket. Thomas Fletcher, 38 years old, had hunted these woods since childhood. He positioned himself behind a fallen log with clear view of the fort's eastern wall, adjusted the log slightly to create a rifle rest, checked his powder and ball, breathed slowly, settling into the hunter's patience that couldn't be taught, only learned through years of waiting for the perfect shot. Around mid-morning, a British soldier appeared on the wall, red coat visible against the mansion's white paint. The man was carrying something, a bucket, probably for the well. Fletcher tracked him, breathing steady. The distance was about 180 yards. Slight breeze from the west. The British soldier paused, set down his bucket, stretched his back. Fletcher exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. Smoke obscured his vision momentarily. When it cleared, the British soldier was down, the bucket rolling away. Fletcher reloaded mechanically, his hands performing the familiar ritual, while his mind wrestled with what he'd just done. That was someone's son, someone's husband maybe, someone's friend. A man who'd been alive 10 seconds ago and now was dead because Fletcher was a good shot. But that man had been standing on Rebecca Mott's wall like he owned it, had been living in her house, sleeping in her beds, occupying property taken by force. Fletcher pushed the conflicted feelings down and watched for another target. This was war. Complicated feelings were a luxury for after the shooting stopped. Inside the fort, Sergeant William Booth heard the shot and the cry as the soldier fell. 28 years old, enlisted at 18, he'd seen combat in 3 different colonies. He organized the response quickly, pulling men back from exposed positions, setting up covering fire to suppress the American riflemen. But the Americans had patience and superior weapons for this kind of fight. Every time a British soldier showed himself for more than a few seconds, a rifle cracked and someone fell or scrambled for cover. The psychological impact was immediate and corrosive. Simple tasks like fetching water or visiting the latrines became dangerous. Men couldn't move freely within their own fortification during daylight hours. McPherson recognized the problem. American riflemen were making life inside the fort miserable. He organized a night sortie for May 9th, sending Booth with 20 men to disrupt the American siege works and hopefully kill or capture some of the sharpshooters. They went out at 2 in the morning. The darkness was nearly total. New moon, heavy clouds blocking starlight. Booth led his men quietly through a sally port in the palisade, moving by feel more than sight. The plan was simple. Reach the American trenches, kill anyone they found, destroy whatever siege equipment they could, then return before the alarm could bring overwhelming numbers against them. They got within 30 yards of the American positions before someone heard them. A shout went up, muskets fired blindly into darkness. Then it was chaos, hand-to-hand fighting where nobody could tell friend from enemy, just shapes in blackness trying to kill each other with bayonets and club muskets and knives. Booth found himself wrestling with an American soldier, both men grunting with effort. The American was strong, farm-strong, and fought with desperate intensity. They went down together in the mud. Booth got his bayonet free and drove it into the man's side. The American screamed and went limp. Booth pulled his bayonet out, breathing hard, hands shaking. He'd killed before. This wasn't his first fight, but killing a man you couldn't see, couldn't identify as enemy except by his position, killing someone who might have been standing next to you if the war had gone differently, that hollowness never went away. The British withdrew after 15 minutes of fighting, having inflicted casualties and disrupted the siege work temporarily, but they'd lost 3 men themselves, and the Americans would have the trenches repaired by dawn. The sortie bought time, but not much of it. May 10th dawned with American trenches noticeably closer to the fort. Lee's artillery, 2 small field pieces, nothing powerful enough to breach walls, but useful for suppression, began firing at first light. The cannonballs struck the mansion's walls with crashes that shook the building. Most shots didn't penetrate, but the psychological impact on the garrison was significant. The constant bombardment reminded everyone inside that their position was slowly degrading. Lee and Marion met that morning to assess progress. They stood away from their troops, speaking privately about the timeline that controlled everything. Lee's frustration was evident. We're advancing, but not fast enough. Rawdon left Charleston yesterday according to our scouts, 90 miles away, moving 15 miles per day. 6 days before he arrives. We need this fort in 4 days maximum, or we're trapped. Marion looked toward the fort, calculating. Conventional siege will take a week minimum. We don't have a week. We could attempt a direct assault. My Legion troops could storm the walls and die in large numbers attacking uphill into prepared defenses. I've seen enough dead boys, Harry. I won't order that kind of slaughter for a symbolic victory. Lee knew Marion was right, but hated the implication. Then what? We withdraw and let them hold the position? There's one option. Mrs. Mott already gave us the means. Marion's weathered face showed no emotion. We burn them out. Lee's aristocratic sensibilities rebelled. Francis, burning property feels dishonorable. Not how war should be conducted. Marion's laugh was short and bitter. Honorable men die in honorable defeats. I've attended enough funerals, dug enough graves. The British hang prisoners, burn farms, terrorize civilians. You want to fight them with European rules they abandoned 2 years ago? Those rules exist for reasons, to maintain some civilization even in war. You were raised to fight by European rules, Harry. Formations, sieges, gentlemanly surrender. Those rules were written by men with castles to protect their privileges. We're fighting for men with farms. Different war, different rules. The tension between them was palpable. Class and culture and military philosophy colliding. But Lee had learned to trust Marion's instincts over his own training. His voice was quiet. If we do this, when they surrender, they're treated with full honors. No revenge, no humiliation. Soldiers doing their duty deserve respect. Marion nodded. Agreed. We burn them out. Then we treat them like the brave men they are. They developed the plan over the next day. Captain Finley of Lee's Legion would lead a small team with the arrows Rebecca had provided. They'd position themselves in the forward trenches, close enough for accurate shots at the mansion's roof. The arrowheads would be wrapped in pitch-soaked cloth that burned intensely and resisted water. Timing would be critical. They needed to shoot from close range when wind conditions favored fire spreading. Marion's best riflemen would provide covering fire, targeting any British soldiers who tried to extinguish the flames. It was brutal calculus. The Americans would deliberately shoot men attempting to save the building from burning, but war was brutal. Pretending otherwise just got more people killed. On the evening of May 11th, Lee sat alone in his tent, unable to sleep. Tomorrow they'd burn Rebecca Mott's house. Tomorrow men would die. British soldiers burned or shot, American soldiers killed in the assault. And for what? So he could add another victory to his military record while his family estate back in Virginia faced foreclosure? He thought about the letter from his cousin that he still couldn't answer. £500. Might as well be 5,000. Continental pay didn't cover such debts. Prize money from captures would help, but never enough. He was trapped between the aristocratic standards he was raised to maintain and the financial reality that he couldn't afford those standards. The boots he was wearing, polished despite the siege conditions, had cost more than Private Fletcher made in 3 months. The uniform coat, tailored in Philadelphia before the campaign, cost more than Peter Horry's entire kit. Lee knew his men knew about his debts. Soldiers talked. They knew their commander was broke, that the polished appearance was expensive theater. But they followed him anyway. That realization had come slowly. His men didn't respect the uniform itself. They respected that Lee had led the assault at Paulus Hook, going over the wall first instead of ordering others ahead. They respected that he drilled himself as hard as he drilled them. They respected that he'd returned McPherson's sword after Fort Watson's surrender when he could have kept it as a trophy. The appearance helped. Looking like a commander mattered. But it wasn't why they followed him. They followed because, when it mattered, Lee was willing to die alongside them. The rest was just decoration. He wished someone had explained that before he'd accumulated debts that would eventually ruin him. But understanding came too late most times. In May 1781, he could still hope that victory would somehow solve everything. While Lee wrestled with his thoughts, McPherson made his own preparations. British scouts had reported American activity involving fire and arrows. The intent was obvious. McPherson's countermove was immediate and necessary. He detailed men to the roof with buckets of water, ready to extinguish fires before they spread. He called for volunteers, explaining the danger clearly. You'll be exposed to their sharpshooters. Some of you will likely die. But if that roof catches fire, we all burn. I need men willing to take that risk. Every soldier in the garrison stepped forward, even the young ones, even those who were obviously terrified. McPherson felt pride mixed with the terrible responsibility of command. These men trusted him to spend their lives wisely. Some of them would die tomorrow because he'd ordered them onto an exposed roof. That weight never got lighter. His voice was steady as he selected 12 men for the roof detail. You're the bravest soldiers I've served with. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that courage. Sergeant Booth was among those chosen. As they prepared their positions on the roof, he wondered what his wife Margaret was doing right then, probably putting their son Michael to bed, telling him stories about his father who was away at war. Michael was 7 now, learning to read, growing up without his father. Booth had tried writing a letter earlier, but couldn't finish it. How do you explain to your wife that you might die tomorrow, defending a house in South Carolina that meant nothing to you personally, fighting for a cause you weren't entirely sure you believed in anymore? All because duty required it? The letter sat unfinished in his pack, unspoken words that would be found if he died, and might explain something to Margaret about why he'd chosen this path. Or maybe wouldn't explain anything at all. Maybe there were no good explanations for why men killed each other over political disagreements. May 12th dawned clear and warm, perfect siege weather if such a thing existed. The spring morning had that crystalline quality where everything seemed sharper, more vivid, the kind of day that made you grateful to be alive, which made it particularly cruel that men were about to die. Rebecca Mott woke early in her cottage. She dressed in her best gown, dark blue silk that she'd saved for occasions that mattered. Her daughters found her in the sitting room, watching the sun rise over the hill where her mansion stood. Rebecca Jr.'s voice was soft. "Mother, you don't have to watch." "Yes, I do. If I'm asking them to burn it, the least I can do is witness what it costs." Mary brought tea and the three women sat together in silence. They'd said everything there was to say the night before. Now there was just waiting and whatever came after. The American preparations were visible from the cottage. Soldiers moving into position. Captain Finley and his fire arrow team checking their equipment one final time. Marion's riflemen settling into firing positions with clear views of the mansion's roof. At 8 o'clock, the attack began. Finley's voice carried across the sudden quiet. "Knock! Draw! Loose!" 12 flaming arrows arced through the morning air, trailing smoke like meteors. The sound they made was a peculiar whistle hiss that would stay in everyone's memory. 7 arrows hit the roof. 5 missed wide or fell short. The flames guttered momentarily, then caught on the dry wooden shingles. British soldiers on the roof rushed to the fires with buckets. Before they could reach the flames, Marion's riflemen opened fire. The rifles cracked in rapid succession, not volley fire, but individual aimed shots from expert marksmen who'd been hunting since childhood. Peter Horry saw a British sergeant with a bucket moving toward one of the fires. He aimed, exhaled, squeezed. The rifle kicked. The sergeant stumbled, dropped his bucket, fell. Peter reloaded with hands that barely shook, muscle memory overriding thought. Fletcher targeted another defender, another clean shot. The man fell from the roof entirely, landing in the courtyard below with a sickening impact. Fletcher's stomach churned, but his hands kept reloading, kept firing. This was the job, killing men to save other men. The moral calculations could wait for peacetime. A second volley of arrows launched. More flames on the roof. British soldiers trying to fight fires while dodging bullets. The tactical situation was impossible for the defenders. Save the building and die, or survive and watch it burn. McPherson was on the roof himself, throwing water despite the danger. A musket ball grazed his shoulder, tearing cloth and skin. He barely noticed. The flames were spreading faster than they could extinguish them. Multiple fires merging into larger blazes. Heat building, smoke beginning to pour into the upper floors. One of his young lieutenants took a bullet through the throat and died gurgling on his own blood. Another soldier panicked, tried to climb down, and was shot mid-descent. The roof detail was being slaughtered. Sergeant Booth fought the fires mechanically, his mind somewhere else. Thinking about Margaret and Michael, about the letter he hadn't finished, about how stupid it was to die on someone else's roof in a war that had stopped making sense years ago. A bullet passed so close to his head that he felt the air displacement. Another hit the bucket he was carrying, punching through and spilling water. The British couldn't win this fight. Simple mathematics. They couldn't fight the fires and avoid being shot. One or the other, not both. By 9 o'clock, the entire northern section of the roof was engulfed. Flames 10 feet high. Smoke billowing in black columns visible for miles. Inside the mansion, soldiers were coughing, eyes streaming, heat becoming unbearable. McPherson climbed down from the roof, his uniform singed and bloodstained. He made a quick tour of the interior. Upper floors filling with smoke, men passing out from lack of air, the fire spreading to interior timbers. In another hour, maybe less, the building would be uninhabitable. He called his officers together in what had been Rebecca Mott's drawing room. Through the windows, flames were visible, consuming the roof above them. His voice was hoarse from smoke. "Gentlemen, we've fought well. No man here has shown cowardice, but we cannot hold. The fire will kill us all if we stay." Lieutenant Morrison, his face blackened by smoke. "Sir, relief is perhaps 40 hours away. And these men deserve to see relief arrive. Dead soldiers don't get rescued." McPherson's certainty was absolute. "I'm raising the white flag. We'll negotiate honorable terms. You've all earned that much." Morrison straightened. "No shame in recognizing reality, sir. None at all. There's no honor in pointless death. We made them pay for this victory. Now let's survive to fight another day." At 9:30, a white cloth appeared above the fort's walls. The shooting stopped immediately. The sudden silence after hours of gunfire was disorienting. Ears ringing, men looking around confused by the absence of noise that had become normal. Marion and Lee approached under a flag of truce. McPherson met them at the fort entrance. His uniform damaged, but his bearing dignified, despite defeat. McPherson's opening was direct. "Gentlemen, I offer surrender on honorable terms." Lee's response was equally straightforward. "You defended well, Lieutenant. State your terms." "Parole for all men, released on our word not to fight until properly exchanged. Officers retain swords. Personal belongings remain ours. Treatment as prisoners of war, not criminals." Marion's practical concern: "How do we know your men won't rejoin Rawdon's column in 2 days?" McPherson's voice hardened. "Because I give my word as a British officer, and unlike some, we honor our commitments." The insult hung in the air. Lee's spine stiffened. "Lieutenant, we are not rebels breaking oaths. We are soldiers of the United States. We honor agreements as strictly as any British officer claims to." The two men stared at each other, tension crackling. Marion intervened smoothly. "Your terms are acceptable, Lieutenant. You fought with courage. That deserves respect regardless of flags." Some of the stiffness left McPherson's posture. "Thank you, Colonel Marion. Your reputation suggested you might be less civilized." "I'm pleased to find that reputation inaccurate." Marion's smile was thin. "I'm uncivilized when necessary, Lieutenant. Today, courtesy serves better than revenge." Lee stepped forward, his voice carrying weight beyond his years. "Lieutenant McPherson, war makes enemies of men who should be brothers. Peace will make brothers of men who were enemies. Today, we begin that process." McPherson studied the young Virginia aristocrat, seeing something he recognized despite the political differences. "You're an optimist, Colonel Lee. I hope you're correct." "Very well. We'll march out at 3 o'clock with full honors. Agreed?" "Agreed." The formal surrender ceremony took place on schedule. 165 British soldiers formed ranks and marched out with military precision despite exhaustion and defeat. A drummer beat the slow march. Their colors were cased rather than paraded, a sign of honorable defeat. Officers marched at the front, swords drawn. McPherson formally presented his sword to Lee. The young colonel accepted it, held it for a moment, then handed it back. "You defended honorably, Lieutenant. Keep your sword. You earned the right to wear it." The gesture clearly moved McPherson. "That's generous, Colonel. Thank you." Lee's Legion troops stood at attention, showing professional respect. Marion's militia had mixed reactions. Some wanted revenge for burned farms and killed neighbors. Others saw fellow soldiers who'd done their duty. Private Sullivan watched a young British soldier, perhaps 18 or 19, crying silently in the ranks. Sullivan's own son was 17, could easily be that boy if circumstances had gone differently. With the surrender complete, both sides worked together to fight the remaining fire. British and American soldiers in the same bucket brigades, passing water to save what they could of Rebecca's mansion. The cooperation would have seemed impossible hours earlier, when they'd been trying to kill each other. Now it felt natural, almost inevitable. Professional soldiers shared more with each other than with the civilians they supposedly fought for. The roof was destroyed, perhaps 60% gone. Upper floors damaged extensively by fire, water, and smoke. But the basic structure stood. With significant work, the house could eventually be rebuilt. Not restored to its original glory, but made habitable again. At 4 o'clock, Rebecca Mott walked onto her property for the first time in 12 months. Her daughters accompanied her. American and British soldiers stopped working to watch. Something about her bearing demanded attention, not arrogance but calm dignity in the face of loss. She walked through the gate where British soldiers had evicted her, across the courtyard where her gardens had been, to the mansion entrance where she paused, surveying the damage visible through the open door. The interior was devastation. Drawing room walls blackened by smoke, windows shattered. Her husband's study with its desk charred and books destroyed. Upstairs bedrooms with collapsed ceilings and ankle-deep ash. Most of her possessions were gone, consumed by flames or ruined by water and smoke. But some things had survived. A portrait of Jacob, smoke-damaged but recognizable. the childhood dolls her daughters had left behind, somehow unburned in a corner. Her mother's silver tea service, saved by British soldiers before the surrender, an act of consideration from men who'd been enemies. Rebecca Jr. held her childhood doll, tears streaming. I remember when Papa gave me this. I was 6. He said it would always keep me safe. Mary's anger was more visible. They destroyed everything, all of it. Rebecca's voice remained steady. Things can be replaced. People cannot. Freedom cannot. Was it worth it, Mother? Rebecca turned to face her daughters fully. Ask yourself, would you rather have this house with British soldiers in it, or ashes you can rebuild on free soil? Mary held her mother's gaze for a long moment, then answered quietly, free soil. Then it was worth it. Rebecca walked to where Lee, Marion, and McPherson stood together, an unlikely trio united by mutual exhaustion. All 3 men straightened as she approached. Her words were simple and direct. Lieutenant McPherson, I am Rebecca Mott. This was my home. McPherson removed his hat. Mrs. Mott, I have no adequate words. I am profoundly sorry for your loss. She cut him off gently. You were doing your duty, Lieutenant, as were these gentlemen, as was I. No apologies necessary among soldiers. The statement elevated her to their level, not victim, but fellow combatant. McPherson recognized the grace in it and nodded acceptance. Rebecca continued, her voice carrying across the courtyard. Gentlemen, all of you, I have a cottage nearby, small but adequate. Would you honor me by dining there this evening? The request produced stunned silence. Marion recovered first. Ma'am, you've lost your home. We cannot impose. Colonel Marion, this war will end someday. When it does, we must live together again as neighbors. We might as well practice civility now. A slight smile. Besides, I suspect you're all hungry. Lee, Marion, and McPherson exchanged glances. Some unspoken communication passed between them. Recognition that this woman's courage demanded respect that transcended the day's violence. McPherson spoke first. Mrs. Mott, I would be honored to accept your invitation. Lee nodded. As would I. Marion's gruff voice held warmth. Don't have fancy manners, ma'am, but I'll come. Rebecca's smile was genuine. Colonel Marion, I suspect you have better manners than most men in Charleston. 7 o'clock. Officers only. I don't have room for everyone, though I wish I did. As she left to prepare, Lee turned to his companions. That woman just watched her life burn and invited us to dinner, including the man whose troops occupied her house. Marion's voice was thoughtful. Some people break under pressure. Others get harder. She's steel underneath that silk gown. McPherson's assessment was simpler. She's braver than half the soldiers I've served with. They stood together, 3 officers from 3 different worlds, watching the smoke still rising from the burned mansion. Tomorrow they'd be enemies again, or at least on opposite sides of the larger conflict. But tonight, they'd break bread in Rebecca Mott's cottage and remember that underneath uniforms and flags, they were all just people trying to survive a war none of them had started. The sun was setting, painting the smoke golden. Spring evening in South Carolina. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird was singing, indifferent to human conflicts. The world kept turning regardless of who won or lost individual battles. In 3 hours, former enemies would gather at a small table. They'd eat simple food prepared by a widow and her daughters. They'd talk about the battle, about duty, about the costs of war. They'd discover, perhaps to their surprise, that enemies could be honorable, that respect could survive violence, that the peace they'd eventually have to build together was worth starting now, even in small ways. But that was hours away. For now, soldiers made camp and tended wounds and tried to process what they'd survived. Rebecca and her daughters prepared dinner with whatever supplies remained, and on the hill, the mansion smoldered, a monument to the price of freedom and the choices people made when everything was at stake. 7 o'clock arrived with the soft light that only happens in late spring evenings. Golden rays streaming through west-facing windows, making everything gentler than reality suggested it should be. Rebecca's cottage dining room was small but carefully arranged. A table set for 8 with whatever china had survived the eviction, mismatched but clean. candles supplementing the fading daylight. The smell of ham and cornbread filled the air. Simple food elevated by care and circumstance. The attendees arrived in pairs and alone, each carrying the weight of the day differently. Henry Lee came first, uniform brushed despite the siege conditions. Francis Marion followed minutes later, looking uncomfortable in any setting with walls and formality. Donald McPherson arrived precisely on time, a professional soldier's habit that survived defeat. Captain Finley from Lee's Legion and Captain Lewis from Marion's militia completed the group, along with Rebecca's daughters serving. The initial atmosphere was thick with awkwardness. Men who'd been trying to kill each other 8 hours earlier now sat at the same table. Rebecca set the tone through sheer force of gracious determination, treating everyone equally, discussing the food and weather in anything except the battle. The meal began with ham that Rebecca had cured herself months earlier, back when she'd still had a smokehouse and time for such things. Cornbread her daughters had baked that afternoon. Vegetables from a garden that had somehow survived being adjacent to a military fortification. Wine from bottles Rebecca had been saving, though she'd never articulated what she was saving them for. Small talk carried them through the first course. Weather observations, comments on the quality of the food, careful avoidance of anything substantive. Then Mary, serving wine, couldn't contain herself any longer. Her voice was quiet but penetrated the polite conversation. "Lieutenant McPherson, may I ask, do you believe in your cause?" Awkward silence crashed down. Rebecca opened her mouth to redirect, but McPherson raised his hand slightly, accepting the question. His answer was measured. "Miss Mott, I believe in my duty to my king, but I wonder sometimes if this war is worth its cost. To anyone." Lee leaned forward. "All wars cost too much. The question is whether the cause justifies the price." Marion's rough voice added weight. "We're fighting for the right to govern ourselves. Self-determination. Is there a higher cause?" McPherson considered his wine glass. "King George would say you're fighting to escape lawful authority. That legitimate government requires subjects to obey even when they disagree." Rebecca's quiet interjection stopped the debate from becoming argument. "Gentlemen, I think we're fighting because neither side knows how to stop. We've invested too much blood to walk away. Pride has trapped us all in a conflict that's consuming everything we claim to be protecting." The observation was uncomfortable because it was accurate. No one rushed to dispute it. Marion studied Rebecca with new appreciation. "You're suggesting both sides are prisoners of our own choices? Aren't we? Lieutenant McPherson can't abandon his duty without betraying everything he was raised to honor. You gentlemen can't stop fighting without surrendering the principles you've sacrificed so much for. We're all trapped by commitments we made before we fully understood their cost." McPherson's voice held something like relief. "Mrs. Mott, you've articulated what I haven't been able to admit. I don't know how to stop being what I am, even when I'm not entirely certain anymore what I'm fighting for." Lee's aristocratic training made him uncomfortable with such honesty. Surely duty itself is reason enough. Service to legitimate authority. "Harry." Marion's use of Lee's first name created intimacy. "You don't believe that any more than I do. We're fighting because we committed to fight, because we can't face the men we've lost and tell them their deaths were for nothing, because stopping feels like betrayal." The young colonel's face showed the struggle. "Then what separates us from mercenaries? If we're just fighting because we started and can't stop?" Marion's answer came from decades of warfare. "Intent. We started for principle. We continue for each other, for the men who trust us to make their deaths meaningful. That's not mercenary. That's command." McPherson raised his glass slightly. "Colonel Marion, that's the most honest thing I've heard an officer say in 10 years of service. To making deaths meaningful, then. The only honor left to any of us." They drank to that, an acknowledgement of shared burden that crossed battle lines. The conversation shifted to lighter matters for the second course. But something had changed. The barriers were lower. These men had recognized each other as fellow sufferers in a conflict larger than any individual's control. Captain Finley asked about Lee's famous assault at Paulus Hook. Lee described it with professional detachment, the tactical decisions and timing. But Marion interrupted with a different question. What were you thinking when you went over the wall first, before anyone knew if the plan would work? Lee paused, unusual for someone normally quick with words. I was thinking that I couldn't ask men to do something I wasn't willing to do first, and that if we failed, at least I'd die quickly instead of living with the guilt of sending them to die while I stayed safe. McPherson nodded understanding. Command is terrible burden. We spend other men's lives to achieve objectives. Sometimes the objectives are necessary. Sometimes they're pointless. But we don't always know which until afterward. Rebecca had been listening quietly, letting the military men talk. Now she spoke, her voice gentle but commanding attention. Gentlemen, forgive an observation from someone who's never commanded soldiers, but it seems to me you're all struggling with the same question. How do you live with what duty requires? Marion's weathered face showed something like gratitude. That's exactly the question, ma'am, and I've been at war 20 years without finding a good answer. Perhaps because there isn't one. Perhaps the best we can do is carry the weight together and remember we're still human underneath the uniforms. The evening light was fading now, candles becoming the primary illumination. The warm glow softened hard lines in faces worn by war. Rebecca nodded to her daughters, who brought dessert, apple pie made with fruit preserved from last autumn. As they ate, the conversation deepened naturally. McPherson asked Lee about Virginia, genuinely curious about a place he'd never seen. Lee described it with unexpected poetry, revealing someone who loved his home, despite its contradictions. Marion talked about the South Carolina Low Country, the swamps that most people feared, but he considered beautiful. Lewis, Marion's militia captain, asked McPherson about England. The British officer's description revealed homesickness he normally concealed. Rolling green hills, stone fences that have stood for centuries, villages where every family knows every other family back 6 generations. It's orderly, predictable, nothing like this frontier. Do you miss it? Every day. But I made commitments. A man who abandons his duty because it's difficult isn't a man worth being. Lee's voice was thoughtful. Yet staying with duty that no longer makes sense requires different courage than abandoning it. Perhaps, or perhaps I'm just too stubborn to admit I made a mistake years ago. The honesty was startling. A British officer admitting doubt to American enemies. But they weren't enemies in this moment, in this small room with candlelight and the remnants of pie. They were just soldiers talking about the universal struggles of their profession. Rebecca waited until dessert was finished before speaking again. When she did, her words carried the weight of someone who'd earned the right to be heard. Gentlemen, I'm 49 years old. My husband died 13 years ago. I raised 2 daughters alone, ran a plantation, built a life. Today I watched that life burn, and I want to tell you what I've learned, if you'll permit an old widow her observations. Every man at the table gave her complete attention. Do I regret my choice? No, but I regret deeply that it was necessary, that good men, she gestured to include all of them, spend their days killing other good men over political disagreements that could be resolved through conversation if pride permitted it. Lieutenant McPherson, you fought bravely today. So did Captain Finley. So did the young man in Colonel Marion's militia who shot one of your soldiers. None of you are evil, yet you tried to kill each other. Why? Because men in London and Philadelphia cannot compromise. Because pride matters more than lives. Because we've forgotten how to talk without shooting. Her voice grew stronger. This dinner we're having, this is more revolutionary than any battle. We're proving that enemies can become, perhaps not friends, but respectful adversaries. When the war ends, and gentlemen, it will end, we must live together. Parliament will make peace with Congress. But we must make peace with our neighbors, with the people we've been trying to kill. My house burned today. I'd burn 100 houses if it meant my daughters live free. Not just from British rule, but from the tyranny of endless violence, from the assumption that disagreement requires bloodshed, from the cycle of revenge that destroys communities and souls equally. She looked at each man individually. So fight your war, do your duty, but remember, the war ends. The peace we build afterward, that's what lasts. That's what determines whether any of this suffering meant something or was just pointless waste. The silence that followed was profound. Not awkward, but weighted with recognition. Rebecca had articulated what every soldier in that room had felt, but couldn't express. McPherson stood, raising his glass. To Mrs. Mott, who taught soldiers about wisdom we should have learned years ago. All stood, toasted. Mary and Rebecca Jr. were crying, pride mixing with grief. Even Marion's eyes were wet, rare for a man hardened by 2 decades of warfare. The dinner concluded shortly after. Officers thanked Rebecca for hospitality that transcended the day's violence. McPherson shook hands with Lee and Marion, an acknowledgement that respect had survived battle. As the guests departed, Rebecca stood on her small porch, watching them walk back to their respective camps. But 3 remained: Rebecca, Lee, and Marion. She'd brought out her last bottle of wine and 3 chairs. The night was clear, stars bright in a sky unpolluted by anything except the lingering smoke from her burned mansion. They sat in comfortable silence initially, the kind of quiet that comes after significant conversations, when additional words seem unnecessary. Distant sounds of soldiers settling for the night. Closer sounds of Carolina spring. Crickets, night birds. The normal sounds of peace intruding on war. Lee finally spoke. Mrs. Mott, may I ask something perhaps impertinent? After today, Colonel, impertinence seems impossible. Ask, do you truly not regret your choice? Watching your home burn? Rebecca considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I regret the necessity, not the choice. There's a difference. Marion's voice held understanding. Most people confuse those 2 things. What about you, gentlemen? Do you regret this war? Lee's answer was immediate. Every day, and never. Marion laughed, the sound startling in the quiet. That's the most honest thing you've said all week, Harry. Rebecca smiled. You called him Harry. When did you 2 become friends? Somewhere between wanting to punch him and wanting to protect him. Lee grinned despite himself. I wanted to punch you too, Francis. I know. You're not subtle, boy. The easy banter revealed friendship forged through shared danger. Rebecca recognized it and felt warmth at witnessing men transcending class and background through mutual respect. Her voice turned more serious. This war will end eventually. Years from now, will anyone remember what happened today? Lee's answer was immediate. Historians will record it. Fort Mott, May 12, 1781. British garrison surrendered. American forces advanced. Marion added dryly, but they won't record this. 3 people on a porch, trying to make sense of it all. Perhaps that's better. Let them remember the victory. We'll remember the cost. Lee pressed. Is there a difference between the 2? Of course. Victories are clean in history books. Costs are messy, real. Victories inspire. Costs teach. We need both, but we shouldn't confuse them. Marion studied her face in the starlight. Mrs. Mott, you're a philosopher. I'm a widow who burned her house today. Philosophy is all I have left. She paused, then continued. But I've learned something through this experience. Sacrifice is only meaningful when it's shared. Alone, my burned house is tragedy. Together with your risks and your men's deaths, it becomes purpose. Lee leaned forward, engaged. Shared sacrifice as the foundation of community. Exactly. We're connected now. You, me, Lieutenant McPherson, everyone who was here today. Connected by what we gave up and what we survived. That connection matters more than whatever political settlement eventually ends this war. Marion's voice was thoughtful. You're saying the relationships we build through shared suffering are what actually creates nations, not declarations or constitutions. Those are important too. But yes, nations are built by people who've sacrificed together and remember what it cost, who understand that freedom isn't free because they've paid the price personally. They sat with that for a moment. Then Marion stood, stretching. Ma'am, we march at dawn. Need to consolidate our hold on this position before Rawdon arrives. Thank you for your hospitality and your courage. Both matter more than you know. Rebecca stood as well. Thank you for giving my sacrifice meaning, Colonel Marion. Don't let it be wasted. I won't. We won't. He looked at Lee. Ready, Harry? Lee stood but paused. Mrs. Mott, I promise you, this story will be told, not just in military dispatches, but truthfully. Your sacrifice will be remembered. Rebecca's voice was firm. Don't promise remembrance, Colonel. Promise victory. That's the only thing that makes today worthwhile. Marion nodded approval. She's right. Remembrance is luxury. Victory is necessity. The three stood together, an unlikely triangle of respect. Marion raised his tin cup of wine. To victory, then. Lee raised his. And to the cost of earning it. Rebecca raised hers. And to the peace that follows. Without that, victory is just another word for temporary advantage. They drank, and the two officers departed into the night. Rebecca stood alone on her porch, looking at the dark shape of her ruined mansion on the hill. Smoke still rose from it, visible against the stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight had proven something important, that enemies could become something more complicated than friends, but more valuable than simple adversaries. That shared humanity could survive political differences if people chose to remember it. She went inside where her daughters waited. Together they cleaned the dishes, put away chairs, restored order to their small space. Tomorrow they'd face whatever came next, but tonight they'd hosted a dinner that mattered in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for years. The fall of Fort Mott had immediate and cascading consequences that shattered British control of South Carolina's interior. Lord Rawdon, marching to relieve the garrison, learned of its surrender when he was still 30 miles distant. His response was immediate and strategic. He turned his entire column around and retreated to Charleston. The decision marked a crucial turning point. Rawdon was experienced and capable, not prone to panic. His retreat signaled his assessment that the interior forts were no longer defensible. If Fort Mott could fall in 4 days to a force using unconventional tactics, no British position was secure. Better to consolidate around Charleston and Savannah than waste troops defending isolated posts that would fall one by one. Without Rawdon's relief column, the remaining British forts were exposed. Lee and Marion moved immediately to capitalize on their momentum. Fort Granby fell on May 15th after a 2-day siege. The garrison surrendered when they saw the same fire arrow tactics being prepared. The British commander chose discretion over pointless resistance. Fort Galphin fell on May 21st. Augusta, a larger and more significant position, surrendered on June 5th after extended siege. The British attempted to hold 96, the strongest remaining interior fort, but even that position eventually fell to American forces in June. By July 1781, British control of South Carolina had collapsed completely. They held only Charleston and Savannah, major port cities that could be supplied and reinforced by sea. Everything else, the interior countryside that had seemed so securely pacified just months earlier, was back in American hands. The strategic impact rippled outward. Lord Cornwallis in Virginia depended on secure supply lines through the Carolinas. With South Carolina's interior in American hands, those supply lines were cut. British forces couldn't move freely through the region. Foraging parties faced constant ambush. Convoys required heavy escorts that reduced operational flexibility. Cornwallis found himself increasingly isolated. His offensive operations in Virginia achieved tactical successes, but gained no strategic advantage. By September 1781, he'd been maneuvered into a defensive position at Yorktown on the Virginia coast. When French naval forces arrived and Washington's army besieged the position, Cornwallis had no viable options. No southern base to retreat to because South Carolina was lost. No supply lines to sustain extended defense. On October 19, 1781, exactly 5 months after Fort Mott's surrender, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army at Yorktown. 8,000 British soldiers laid down their arms. The defeat effectively ended the Revolutionary War, though peace negotiations would drag on for 2 more years. The path from Fort Mott to Yorktown was direct. If that South Carolina mansion had held, if Rebecca Mott had refused to sacrifice her property, if Lee and Marion had failed to coordinate effectively, the entire Southern campaign might have stalled. British forces would have maintained their interior positions. Cornwallis wouldn't have been isolated. Yorktown might never have happened. Small choices, enormous consequences. One widow's decision to burn her house contributed to ending a war and birthing a nation. History is built on such moments. Individual choices made under pressure that ripple outward in ways no one can predict at the time. The people involved in Fort Mott's siege carried those events with them for the rest of their lives, though in different ways. Rebecca Bruton Mott lived until 1815, dying at age 83. She remained in her cottage for 2 years after the war, then rebuilt a smaller version of her mansion on the same site. The South Carolina legislature eventually voted her compensation for her losses, though never enough to fully restore what had been destroyed. She never remarried, devoting herself to her daughters and grandchildren. Her fame spread throughout the new nation. Newspapers published accounts of her sacrifice. Poets wrote verses about her courage. George Washington visited her in 1791 during his Southern tour, spending an afternoon discussing the siege and her decision. She was honored as exemplar of revolutionary virtue, proof that women had contributed as much to independence as men. Her daughters married well. Rebecca's sacrifice had brought respect to the family name. Mary married in 1785 and had 5 children. Rebecca Jr. married in 1786 and had 7 children. Both women passed the story of their mother's courage to their descendants, ensuring that Fort Mott's memory survived through family oral history, even when formal histories neglected it. Francis Marion continued his guerrilla campaign until the war's end in 1783. He survived numerous close calls and British attempts on his life. After independence, he returned to his plantation and served in the South Carolina State Senate. He married his cousin Mary Vidot in 1786, a late marriage at age 54, and lived quietly until his death in 1795. Marion's tactical innovations influenced military thinking for generations. His guerrilla warfare tactics were studied by later irregular forces worldwide. During the Vietnam War, American military analysts studying Viet Cong tactics found parallels to Marion's operations in South Carolina. Modern special operations doctrine traces intellectual lineage back to the Swamp Fox, and his understanding that superior force could be defeated by superior knowledge and unconventional thinking. Henry Lee returned to Virginia after the war and initially seemed destined for greatness. He became governor of Virginia from 1791 to 1794. He served in Congress. He delivered the famous eulogy at George Washington's funeral, coining the phrase, "first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen." But the debt that haunted him during the war eventually destroyed him. Lee lived beyond his means, speculated unwisely, borrowed constantly. By 1809, he faced bankruptcy and public humiliation. He spent time in debtor's prison, a Revolutionary War hero imprisoned for debt. In 1813, he fled to the West Indies to escape creditors, leaving his family behind. He died in 1818 on Cumberland Island, Georgia, broken financially and physically. He was trying to return to Virginia but died during the journey, age 62. His son Robert Edward Lee, born in 1807, grew up in his father's shadow, aware of both his military genius and his financial destruction. That son would become famous in his own right during a different war, fighting for a different cause. Lieutenant Donald McPherson was paroled after Fort Mott's surrender and eventually exchanged for American prisoners. He returned to service and fought at Yorktown, where he was captured again when Cornwallis surrendered. After the war, he returned to Britain. Military records suggest he continued his army career, but never rose to high rank. He died in obscurity around 1802, remembered primarily as the officer who lost Fort Mott. Sergeant William Booth survived the siege and the war. He returned to England and his wife Margaret and son Michael. He lived until 1809, working as a clerk in a London counting house. He never spoke much about the war, according to family letters. Some experiences resist words. Peter Horry, Marion's young relative, survived the war despite his recklessness. He became a militia officer in his own right, eventually achieving the rank of brigadier general in the South Carolina militia. He collaborated with Mason Locke Weems on an early biography of Marion published in 1809, though historians consider it highly romanticized. Peter died in 1815, having outlived his famous uncle by 20 years. The mansion at Fort Mott was partially rebuilt after the war, but never restored to its original grandeur. Parts of it survived into the 19th century. Today, the site is preserved as an archaeological park, though little remains of the original structures. Markers explain what happened there in May 1781. Tourists read the plaques, take photos, move on. Few understand the full weight of what occurred there or what it cost the people involved. The lessons from Fort Mott operate on multiple levels: military, political, personal. Each offers insights that remain relevant. Militarily, Fort Mott demonstrated that asymmetric warfare could defeat superior conventional forces. Lee and Marion's combination of professional troops and guerrilla fighters, conventional siege tactics, and unconventional fire weapons created something the British couldn't counter. The partnership between regular army and militia, between aristocratic officer and frontier fighter, showed that effectiveness mattered more than social purity. Modern military doctrine incorporates these lessons. Combined arms operations, civil-military cooperation, irregular warfare, all trace intellectual lineage to campaigns like Fort Mott. The fundamental insight remains: determined defenders can be defeated by creative attackers willing to think beyond conventional approaches. Politically, Fort Mott illustrated the importance of civilian support in revolutionary warfare. Rebecca Mott's agency and sacrifice were militarily significant. Without her permission and assistance, the siege would have taken longer, possibly failed entirely. Her choice demonstrated that revolutions require more than armies. They require populations willing to sacrifice for the cause. This lesson has proven repeatedly relevant. Revolutionary movements succeed or fail based partly on civilian commitment. Vietnam, Afghanistan, countless other conflicts showed that military superiority means little if the population actively opposes occupation. Fort Mott was an early example of this dynamic. Personally, Fort Mott teaches about the nature of sacrifice and honor. Rebecca's choice to burn her house required moral courage that matched any battlefield bravery. Her understanding that freedom costs and someone must pay remains timeless truth. Every generation faces moments when abstract principles demand concrete sacrifices. How people respond in those moments defines them in their society. The dinner scene teaches equally important lessons about maintaining humanity during conflict. McPherson, Lee, and Marion sitting together after trying to kill each other, recognizing shared burdens and mutual respect. That model of how enemies can become something more complicated than friends, but less simple than adversaries, offers hope for any conflict. Yet Fort Mott's story contains uncomfortable truths modern Americans must acknowledge. The fight for liberty occurred within a society built partly on slavery. Marion owned enslaved people. Rebecca's plantation wealth came from enslaved labor. The British offered freedom to enslaved people who joined their side, and many did, seeking liberty that American revolutionaries denied them. This contradiction, fighting for freedom while denying freedom, haunted the revolution and would eventually tear the nation apart 80 years later in a civil war that dwarfed the revolution in casualties and destruction. We can honor Rebecca Mott's courage while acknowledging that the society she fought for was fundamentally unjust to millions. We can admire Marion's tactical genius while recognizing his complicity in slavery. History is complicated, real people making real choices within systems they didn't entirely create or control. Judging them requires understanding their context while not excusing their moral failures. Fort Mott teaches both inspiration and caution, celebrating the courage while acknowledging the contradictions. For contemporary Americans, Fort Mott raises questions about sacrifice and polarization. The nation faces divisions that sometimes feel insurmountable. Political opponents seem like enemies. Civil discourse breaks down into tribal warfare. Into this context, Fort Mott offers a counter-narrative. Enemies can recognize each other's humanity. Respect can survive profound disagreement. Shared sacrifice creates bonds stronger than political differences. Rebecca's wisdom remains relevant. We're fighting because neither side knows how to stop. Pride has trapped us. Could be said about modern political conflicts where neither side can compromise without feeling they've betrayed their principles. The dinner scene where former enemies broke bread offers a model, not of agreement but of mutual recognition, that everyone involved carries burdens and deserves dignity. The story also asks whether modern Americans still understand sacrifice for collective good. Rebecca Mott chose country over property, principle over personal interest. Can contemporary society, focused on individual rights and personal fulfillment, still produce people willing to sacrifice significantly for communal benefit? Or has that kind of civic virtue become obsolete? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're genuine challenges for any democracy. Free societies require citizens willing to sacrifice for the common good. If everyone pursues self-interest exclusively, collective action becomes impossible. Fort Mott reminds us what previous generations gave up so we could inherit freedom. What are we willing to give up to pass it forward? On that hill overlooking the Congaree River in May 1781, several profound truths converged. Military ingenuity matters. Civilian sacrifice matters. Honor between enemies matters. Individual choices matter enormously, rippling outward in ways impossible to predict. Rebecca Mott could have refused, protected her property, argued reasonably that one house shouldn't matter against the larger strategic picture. No one would have blamed her for prioritizing personal interest. McPherson could have fought to the death rather than surrender. Chosen symbolic resistance over practical survival. His men would have burned for his pride, but he'd have avoided the stain of defeat. Lee and Marion could have failed to cooperate, let class differences and cultural gaps prevent effective partnership. They'd have had excellent excuses for failure. Any of these alternate choices would have changed history, but they made the choices they made. Hard choices, costly choices, choices that hurt. And because they chose as they did, 165 British soldiers lived. American independence moved closer. A widow demonstrated courage that inspired a nation. And enemies sat at table together, proving humanity could survive warfare. The mansion burned that day. Timber and shingles and memories transformed to smoke and ash. But Rebecca rebuilt, the structure rising again from those ashes. Physical buildings can be restored. The story, though, the story endures, passed through generations, teaching lessons about sacrifice and honor and the price of freedom, reminding each generation that liberty costs. Someone always pays, and that payment, when made willingly for principle, matters more than any monument or memorial. At Fort Mott's site today, few visitors linger. It's a small historical marker in a state full of Revolutionary War sites. The mansion is gone. The fortifications are gone. Only earth and memory remain. But if you visit in late afternoon when the light hits right, when shadows stretch long across the hill, you can almost see it. Flaming arrows arcing through spring sky. Soldiers fighting on a burning roof. A widow watching everything she built turn to ash. Enemies sharing bread and discovering shared humanity. History isn't made by those who seek glory. It's made by people who choose duty when it costs them everything. Rebecca Mott chose. Francis Marion chose. Henry Lee chose. Even Donald McPherson chose, surrendering with honor when pride might have demanded pointless death. Their choices echo across 240 years, asking every generation, what will you choose when your moment comes? What will you sacrifice? What will you build? And when the test arrives, will you have the courage that Fort Mott demanded and received? Those questions remain unanswered for each person, each generation. But the example stands, carved into American memory. Freedom costs everything. Some people pay it, and that payment makes all the difference between nations that survive and nations that deserve to. The smoke has long since cleared from Fort Mott's hill, but the light it cast, the light of sacrifice chosen freely for principle, that light still illuminates the path forward for anyone willing to see it and follow where it leads, whatever the cost.